everyone. Welcome back to the Geek Morning Podcast from the Escape Collective, your one-stop shop to bring you up to speed on what's going on this week in the world of bicycle tech. Coming up on this week's show, we've got Yeti's new ASR cross-country race bike to talk about and the evolution of cross-country mountain bike suspension in general. Salsa is undergoing some major changes in its lineup with the addition of 4 new e-bikes. Hot on the heels of a couple of big tech articles that went up this week, we're going to talk about why carbon fiber bikes cost as much as they do, and whether they really are as insane as they seem, or if things maybe aren't as bad as we all think. We've got another handy PSA to share with you that might save you some headache and maybe some teeth down the road. I'm James Huang, and joining me to chat about all this is our senior tech editor in Sydney, Australia, Dave Rome. Hi, Dave.
Hello, James.
Dave, I know you frequently hear from members how maybe something you wrote prompted them to spend a bunch of money on some new tools. And couldn't help but notice that the focus of your latest threaded column was on 3D printing your own tools. So I'm curious, how many people have you heard from who now have said they maybe bought a 3D printer because of you?
I think there's been a few that have said they've been on the fence for a while, and I pushed them off the fence into the land of purchase. So you're welcome. And yeah, I guess for anyone considering a 3D printer, assuming you have a few hours to spare, dive in. It's I know it can be a hard one to justify at first. You're probably not going to make your money back as such, but I've really enjoyed mine. And yeah, the whole premise of that article is that it basically gives you new answers to old problems, or it basically opens the door to you thinking about problems very differently. So that's where I found the most value in a 3D printer.
So let me ask you this, Dave. You're saying that people shouldn't expect that a printer will pay for itself at some point. I think most people don't go into a purchase thinking that it'll pay for itself all the time. But how much are we talking here as far as what people actually need to get going? Like what did you spend for your setup, let's say?
I think mine was about 500 Australian all in with filaments and all that. But and with a high shipping bill because it came from Central Europe. But and that's for a Prusa Mini Plus as covered in the article. But there's cheaper options like a Creality Ender 3, which is sort of a popular Amazon purchase. There's literally thousands and thousands of these in the market. The latest versions of those are pretty good, and I think they're about $200 and something US. So I mean, it's not tiny money, but given that it lets you just create useful products from home, it's it takes up less space on the desk than a paper printer. It's quite a fun world, and I think it'll only become more popular.
I mean, yeah, so it's not no money, but realistically, we're talking like 3 nice tires or like a handlebar, or these days it's like, I don't know, half of a derailleur or something.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, in the general scheme of expensive bike stuff, it's very cheap. And where I sort of said don't expect the payback period or don't expect it to pay for itself. It does depend on what you're printing. Like I have certainly printed some stuff from home where like little light brackets or little adapter accessories that would have cost me maybe $20-$30 a piece. I've been able to print those out of 50 cents worth of plastic. So if you do enough of those, then sure, you probably will end up paying for the printer. But yeah, that's not so much the goal.
As you know, Dave, I've been on the fence for quite a while, and this is maybe yet one more little nudge to push me off the fence.
Yeah.
All right.
Fair.
Anyway, let's go ahead and get into the news. Dave, tell me about this new Yeti ASR, because I will admit I am intrigued.
Yeti's been joking on their social medias that it's like their social campaign's been quite funny. They're like, it's epic and it's nothing like anything else, and you'll see it go past in a blur, but it's nothing like anything else. It's very clever marketing, and where that comes from is that from a silhouette point of view and from a suspension layout point of view, it does look very similar to...
Looks like a session.
It basically looks niche pink bike joke that. Yeah, basically looks like every other cross-country race bike in the market today. So it's got that same silhouette as a Specialized Epic or a Santa Cruz Blur, where it's using basically a flex pivot design with the rear shock on a rocker link. But yeah, Yeti are back into the cross-country game with the ASR. The ASR hadn't been in the company's range since 2017. And prior to that, it was kind of an iconic cross-country bike. So all the way back in 2003, they introduced it with a flex stay pivot with a very similar layout to what it has today. So this isn't necessarily Yeti copying everyone else. It's more Yeti copying everyone else while returning to a design they very much probably owned and are entitled to use. So what it is, very lightweight carbon cross-country race bike, 120mm travel front, 115mm travel rear, progressive geometry, quite similar, arguably somewhere between the old Specialized Epic Evo, which just got superseded a week ago, and the new Specialized Epic 8, which is kind of Specialized's new race bike. It slots right in there, and it in every sense, it's a modern bike. But yeah, I guess it's might look the same, but it's in the finer details where it actually separates itself.
And what are those finer details?
Predominantly, it's in its suspension sag. So how much you sit into that suspension just under your static body weight. And it's normal for race bikes to sort of use 20 to 25% sag, and Yeti have designed it around the use of 30% sag, which is a lot for a cross-country race bike. And it gives... The goal there was to basically give the bike far more traction and control than any other race bike in the market. And the way it rides is kind of achieves that. It really does handle rougher terrain more like a trail bike than it does a cross-country race bike. It doesn't feel flighty or sort of, it doesn't skip over the terrain. That rear wheel just stays in contact. But such a decision comes with compromises. And there's a reason why other race bikes don't use so much sag. And that's because when you pedal or when you shift your weight, say out of the saddle and you sprint out of the saddle, it gets a little mushy.
I mean, some of those compromises are definitely something that I want to talk about. I want to come back to what you were mentioning earlier about how, in Yeti's marketing campaign kind of like had references to the Epic and Blur and kind of how bikes of that genre kind of all look similar right now. And I find that interesting because we have talked for quite a while about how high-performance road bikes have been looking very, very similar for quite a while now, and that's largely because people in that space are looking to solve a very common problem with a set of design options that they're pretty limited by in terms of the UCI technical regulations. And here in the cross-country mountain bike space, we don't necessarily have quite those same restrictions as far as the frame design, but you still have the same goal. Essentially, you have companies that are all trying to provide, 110, 115-ish millimeters of rear wheel travel in a format where essentially everyone's just trying to get really, really light. And it's interesting that you mentioned, kind of the origins of the ASR. Like my wife, when she and I first started dating, she was racing on a team that was on Yetis, and she had two ASR. Well, she had one ASR after another ASR. So I definitely remember that bike very, very well. But looking back through the years of cross-country mountain bike suspension, I find it interesting that we are in this situation where, I think for quite a while, mountain bike suspension just really wasn't very good. And I think back then most of those bikes kind of relied on some sort of shock lockout or platform mechanism in order to pedal well. And then we entered this period where we had kind of more complex suspension geometry because companies and designers were looking to these sort of mechanical solutions to get bikes to pedal well without having to rely so much on that shock technology.
Sure.
And one thing about that Yeti, you said it's designed around 30% sag and gets kind of mushy when you pedal. I guess Yeti's getting around that because, well, one, on the particular bike that you had, it came with the new RockShox flight attendant stuff, which is very, very fancy electronic suspension that has like automatic lockout and all this other stuff. But even when it doesn't have that, it does still have a 3-position lockout for, I guess, is it RockShox suspension across the board?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. So
which is very interesting because Yeti's has a very, very long history with Fox.
Yeah, so it's clear that they're obviously relying on that as a key point in the ASR suspension or pedaling performance, much like kind of what Scott has done for a long time with the Spark.
Correct. Yes.
But so we have a lot more new shock technology, and shocks are certainly better than they have been. Mm-hmm. But what I'm wondering is, if in this effort to make cross-country bikes super light, and with this kind of newfound reliance on the shock to provide the efficiency now instead of, the complexity of all these pivots and stuff, is this a good thing?
I mean, I think these bikes are pretty impressively good right now. I do think there's nuance in it. Flight attendant certainly makes that Yeti amazing, and you forget about whether it pedals well or not in its auto setting because the suspension every few seconds is moving you in between settings to make it pedal well. I don't know. I don't know if it's... Yeah, I don't know how to answer that, actually. I guess ask me the question in another way.
I guess it's obviously a tricky question because it's reliant on a bunch of things. So I think this flight attendant technology sounds super cool. I haven't had a chance to ride it yet, but from everyone that I've talked to that has, they found it pretty amazing. But it is very expensive. It is now a lot of electronic complexity instead of mechanical complexity.
It's also heavier.
It is heavier. There's a lot of batteries. So the bike that you had, I think you said it had 7 batteries on it between different shifters and droppers and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
So I guess it maybe kind of depends on your philosophy as far as what you want out of a mountain bike. I don't know. It almost kind of seems like for the people who still really like mechanical shifting, for example, like that might not be super appealing. Whereas the people who are kind of more earlier adopters and are more interested in technology in general might be more willing to embark on something like that, regardless of the cost and weight and whatever, just because the potential performance benefits are there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to a topic I think we spoke about this last week, where fundamentally I don't necessarily always get on with modern race bikes that require the use of a manual lockout. And it's simply because that manual lockout typically occupies your left hand, but we are nowadays, and we used to have shifting there, but nowadays we have dropper posts. And I use a dropper post heaps now. Like
all the time.
Like as soon as the terrain point's down, I'm dropping that post. And I think that occupies my left hand, and I don't want to have to think about my suspension as well from that left hand. I've always preferred set and forget suspension. I'd much rather leave the suspension on like the trail mode, right? Like the semi-platform and sort of sacrifice a little bit of traction just in order not to think about it. And you can do that with the Yeti. It has that mode, but you also, for every model except the one I tested, you also get a tangled mess of cables in addition to that, because there is, front and rear remote lockout. So my preference is bikes that are more set and forget in their suspension. And flight attendant gives you that while not forcing you to set it. It's constantly changing, but it is definitely, there's barriers to entry there. And for now, it's a very premium technology that will only appeal to probably shop people and shop employees and otherwise wealthy individuals who are willing to take on new technology.
Because how much are we looking at for a flight attendant equipped Yeti ASR now?
It's similar in price point to a S-Works from Specialized. It's actually a little bit less, but it's up in that sort of. I can tell you in Australia, it's 20,000 Australian, which sounds mind-blowing, but I would say the spec is potentially better than an S-Works, and an S-Works in Australia is 24,000.
I mean, both of those numbers are insane.
Yeah. But I don't know. I kind of look at that and just think it's... I think it's representing better value than an S-Works, which is not a high bar to say, but it's, I think it's definitely up there by the time you're looking at a flight attendant equipped bike, because it's not... The flight attendant itself, you can buy at not a ridiculous price point. Like, I think the forks, like, off the top of my head, it was like $1,400 US, and a rear shock's like $900 US to buy them separate. But for a flight attendant bike, you're also looking at having like the Quark power meter as stock, and this bike also has XXSL transmission, and it's got these new DT Swiss carbon wheels, which are incredibly high end. It really is a bike that there's not a lot of room to upgrade on. There's basically nothing you could spend more on.
So let me ask you this. If someone is in the market now for a cross-country full suspension mountain bike, race bike specifically, and they are looking to get something super light, it does seem like a lot of these new school bikes almost are designed around flight attendant ideally to some extent, just because, again, like you said, otherwise you are reliant on having to manually switch modes all the time. If you don't have the money for a flight attendant setup, would you still recommend one of the mechanical ones?
I would, but you just have to be of the rider that's quite willing to have remote lockouts. And there's a lot of people out there that love their remote lockouts and don't think about it. They're just used to it. And if they weren't, the Scott Spark wouldn't exist as a bike.
And Scott sells an awful lot of Sparks, we should point out.
Yeah, exactly. So I think ideally those bikes were probably designed with engineers knowing that flight attendant was coming. And the Scott Spark and its integrated cabling and concealed shock makes a whole lot more sense when you imagine wireless suspension versus cabled. But yeah, I think fundamentally there's a lot of people that don't mind and that disagree with me on this. And then, there's options out there, and go ahead, buy your mechanical bike. You'll love it. But for me, I kind of feel like the market's not necessarily catering to my taste at the moment. There's not a lot of options out there for one of these super nice lightweight cross-country bikes that pedals well without rider intervention. And yes, some are better than others. Some that run closer to 20% sag, and the suspension kinematics there's more anti-squat in the suspension kinematics, so it sort of wants to top out the suspension more as you pedal. Those are probably better suited to me, but yeah, for now the holy grail that I seek it's a rare hen.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I feel like you and I have similar tastes in that sense. And it's funny that Yeti, again, references the Blur in its marketing, because my hunch, based on what that Cervelo ZFS 5 has looked like, is that new Blur, for sure it's going to be another single pivot flex stay bike. Yeah. But my hunch, at least anyway, if that Cervelo is anything to go on, because Cervelo and Santa Cruz are sister brands, that might be a bike like what you're describing that still relies a little bit more on a mechanical setup for pedaling performance, and just could potentially just be better with flight attendant, but I guess we'll see.
Yep. Either way, I'm excited by this space. I'd been wanting such a style, like a 120-ish style racy kind of bike for years and years and years. And I built myself a lightweight trail bike as a result of that, and it's pretty cool to see all these bikes basically getting to where I basically built my lightweight trail bike, but they're even better in ways I wanted. So yeah.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely a good time to be looking for a short travel mountain bike at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, just to stay on this for 1 second longer, I mean, the conversation about them all looking the same, and that kind of just comes through demands of wanting to hit that lightweight structure with that same amount of travel. I actually think the main defining purpose for why they all look the same is
water bottles.
Water bottles. Yeah. If you want 2 water bottles within the main triangle, the rear shock has to go basically above. And at that point, yeah, you're basically all coming to the same design idea. I think Specialized were the first or one of the first to do that style of layout with actual room for 2 water bottles. And everyone else has sort of followed suit, and it works. And when you look at, say, what the new Liv that just came out, which we can assume Giant will come and follow that, or you look at the Factor Lando, where they've decided to stick with a vertical shock to, use the reinforced bottom bracket area for those forces and optimize weight that way. I'm sorry, but it doesn't count if the water bottle mounts to the underside of the top tube. That doesn't count as 2 water bottle compatibility, because if I can feel the second water bottle against my knees, and almost every bottle cage in the market struggles to hold said bottle, it doesn't count. You've still got it's single water bottle capacity with a useless second mount. So there you go.
And what's interesting is, like, for true World Cup level mountain bike racing, they only need 1 bottle. But but for everyone else, and speaking from experience, it is so nice to have not only the ability to carry 2 water bottles, but the ability to carry 2 large water bottles. Especially for like endurance / marathon racing, it is, in my opinion anyway, it's kind of a game changer.
Oh yeah, like when I was doing marathon racing, I ended up on a hardtail for that very reason, is that I didn't want to race with a backpack, and I took the compromise of not having a dual suspension and going with a lighter bike that could handle 2 water bottles. So these days, the fact that you can have it all is something that I wouldn't want to go backwards on. And yeah, for me, having 2 water bottles has sort of been a must-have feature for at least 5 years now. So there's a reason why they all look the same, and I'm not complaining.
Well, like we said, short travel mountain bikes are awfully good these days. All right, moving on. Salsa, it's an American brand and a division within a absolutely huge U.S. distributor, Quality Bicycle Products, or better known as QBP. So it's a brand that's, I would say, known more for its sort of like higher value bikes. And gravel bikes in particular is certainly one of the absolute, maybe the earliest adapters of the segment. But it kind of feels like they've been struggling a little as of late. I mean, I don't have access to their sales figures or anything, but I just don't really see them much, even in the gravel space that they were so early on. But
first movers.
Yeah, well, we got news not too long ago that the brand seems to be pivoting to e-bikes. Maybe not entirely, but they weren't really involved in e-bikes before, and now they've got 2 new gravel and 2 new mountain bike models on the way. So on the gravel side, you've got the Confluence. It's sort of their lighter duty setup with a 40 Newton meter Mahle X35 plus hub drive motor system, and kind of like a lighter duty 250 watt hour battery. Yeah, like flat bar and drop bar build kits. And the pricing is really impressive because it starts at just $2,500 US. That's a pretty solid number for an e-bike. And then sticking to the gravel space, they've got the heavier duty Tributary model, like more progressive geometry. It seems like kind of more mountain bike-ish, more tire clearance, like a full power Bosch mid-drive motor and a much bigger battery.
Is it kind of like a powered version of the Cutthroat?
Hard to say because they haven't really released a whole lot of info right now. The starting price is certainly a lot higher. It's $5,500 US, kind of what you'd expect for something with a Bosch mid-drive motor. And then on the mountain bike side, Salsa hasn't released a whole lot of info, but they're both full suspension bikes, like those 2 gravel bikes. So these are all aluminum across the board. The mountain bikes are going to use the split pivot suspension design. One is kind of more trail focused. They're calling that one the Moraine. And then they've got a Notch, which is kind of more for enduro. Again, starting price is around $5,000. So, I mean, the bikes themselves, I think, will probably be fine. Like of all of them, I'm actually most interested in that Confluence, that lower cost one. But what I find most interesting about this announcement is not so much the bikes themselves, but more the fact that Salsa, that has kind of earned its bread and butter on really pretty accessible I would say like pretty versatile mountain and gravel bikes.
Yeah, they're an adventure brand. Is how they what they pitch themselves as. So yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, I think a lot of brands see e-bikes as sort of their path forward in terms of growth. But I'm wondering, especially with the kind of post-COVID economy that people are, or that bike brands specifically are looking at. And like, if you haven't listened to any of Wade's industry podcasts on this subject, it's a 4-part series. It's very, very worth listening to. But in that post-COVID economy, it kind of makes me wonder if Salsa and maybe other brands are kind of being pushed to look beyond their typical comfort zone to figure out ways to, well, not even just grow, but almost just stay afloat.
Yeah. The skeptical view from within my head is that the e-bike market, while was considered the savior for the industry, is now oversaturated. And like everything in the bike industry becomes oversaturated and then fades because it's just a diluted market for everyone to play in.
It's the new fat bike.
No, it's not the new fat bike. I mean, it's definitely gonna. It's more. Yeah, it's more wider relevance than that. But it's. I would say my take of this is that in the US market, Salsa is actually a surprisingly big brand for smaller retailers, smaller independent bike shops that don't want to deal or be locked into contract with the Giant, the Specialized, the Trek, the what else is there? The Cannondale, the Pon of the bike world, and Salsa has done a pretty great job at sort of being a go-to brand for a lot of those smaller shops that just want to be a bit more independent, a bit more, a bit smaller, a bit more agile in that sense. And this is probably Salsa, or this is QBP, Quality Bike Products, Bicycle Products, who own Salsa. I think this is them answering that call and giving those independent retailers a more affordable e-bike to sell. I think it's probably as simple as that. I mean, they wouldn't do it if there wasn't some demand for this.
I mean, that certainly sounds like the kind of more optimistic way of looking at that. Like, it's just what those dealers want and need, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have no figures to say it's what they need. I would say it's what they want.
I mean, if I were a dealer right now and I were a Salsa dealer specifically, and I was looking at the prospect of being able to offer my customers a pretty reasonably outfitted e-gravel bike for $2,500 US, that seems like it'd be a pretty good thing to have on my showroom floor.
Yep. And I mean, the person buying that is realistically more going to use it for commuting. It's just going to be
just like fun weekend rides in general.
Yeah, just general, around town riding or weekend rides. I don't necessarily see the Salsa customer that you associate with bike packing or doing gravel events buying this bike. But I think it just sounds like a very accessible bike with. And Salsa is very good with accessible geometry and, having a good size range and good standover heights that make newer riders feel comfortable. I think that's who these bikes are for, and they'll probably do well enough to justify their existence.
Well, Salsa.
But that said, I don't. Yeah, sorry, I just don't know if these bikes are a sign of desperate times for Salsa. Like, I don't necessarily think they would, expand the range and bring more models in to save the brand. If that makes sense. I think, I'd like to think there might be some element of truth to that, but
fingers crossed. Hopefully not. And it is probably good that, again, these are all aluminum models, which certainly cost a lot less to develop than carbon fiber ones. It certainly seems to be more in keeping with Salsa's ethos and just kind of what they're all about, really. I mean, Salsa is a brand that's kind of near and dear to my heart. Like, I owned a Salsa La Raza road bike from way, way back in the Ross Schaefer days. It was like this steel TIG welded thing with sort of like, sloping geometry. And this was in like the early 90s when like sloping, when like, I think it was even pre-Giant TCR. So that sort of thing was definitely very unusual. But anyway, I have a soft spot for Salsa. So I hope this launch goes well for them. I guess we are supposed to be expecting some more info around, I think they said something like a May official launch as far as when they're going to release some more info. Okay. But we'll see. If it's anything like the rest of Salsa stuff, it'll be pretty well outfitted for the money. And again, like you said, pretty accessible geometry and fits and stuff like that. So we'll see.
Yeah. No, I too have a soft spot for Salsa, and I certainly don't want to see that brand disappear. Like I really do love what that brand stands for and what they do. And yeah, I mean, I have a Salsa that is one of those bikes that I hoard because even though it doesn't get ridden, can't bring myself to let go of it. Yep.
I very sadly got rid of that road bike quite a while ago. I know who I sold it to, and I'm still in touch with him. But I think he ended up selling it to someone else several years later. So I don't really know where that bike is now.
Lost track of it.
Kind of wish I still had it. That's one of those bikes that I kind of miss, but alas, we can't keep them all. Anyway, let's take a quick break.
I'm going to ask you to tell me what happened in that incident and what Zip's findings are, having had Thomas Gent's wheels shipped back to your headquarters there.
Not immediately, but on the Monday after the incident, I contacted the Lotto Destiny team management. First question, is Thomas okay? We knew he'd finished the race, but obviously injuries can show up afterwards, and we were happy that he was in good stead. The report that immediately followed from the team management stated that Thomas said, I hit something on the side of the road and I fell. And that was the end of his statement. So further information was his tire pressure was within.
You've probably caught wind of some of the controversies surrounding tubeless, hookless road wheels right now, and that was just a bit of the conversation our own Ronan McLaughlin had with the folks at Zip, one of the brands that's arguably at the center of the controversy. So if you want to hear some more from that discussion, make sure you've subscribed to the Geek Warning podcast, as that'll be a special bonus episode that'll be free to everyone this week. You won't want to miss that because it's pretty juicy. All right, back to the show. All right, Dave, we've had a couple of pretty interesting tech pieces go up on the site recently that are, I'd say, kind of related. So we've got first, Ronan's Why Are Bikes So Expensive? I guess more specific to carbon bikes anyway. And then we also have my factory tour of that upstart Canadian bike brand Bridge Bike Works. And I'd say they're interesting and related because they both shine a light from kind of different angles on what goes into making a carbon fiber frame these days and maybe why they cost as much as they do. So for one, I think it's still, from a lot of the comments that I've gotten either directly or from people left on the articles, most people don't know how much manual labor is involved in making most carbon fiber frames. And there's literally hundreds of individual little pieces of carbon fiber that all have to be placed in specific locations. Tons of expensive tooling and raw material and shipping costs have all skyrocketed. You got huge marketing and sponsorship costs, you name it. A whole bunch of stuff goes into it now. But even after all that, and even after the numbers, for example, that Ronan got from the head of Factor, Rob Gatellis, there's still a very legitimate question of why bikes at the top end specifically are as expensive as they are. But there's also the question of if nice road bikes in general are really that much more expensive on average. So kind of throwing back to my past again. So just as an example, so my first, I'd say pretty nice road bike was a Trek 5200 carbon fiber road bike in the early 90s. I think maybe like 93, something like that. Anyway, it came with a carbon fiber frame, like 9-speed Shimano Ultegra with dual control, like the down tube shifters were already out at that point. Aluminum components throughout, aluminum wheels, and that was all for around $2,500 US, if I remember correctly. And adjusting for inflation, that amount would now be about $5,400 US. And looking at the Trek website today, that would get me an Amanda SL6, which comes with a far, far nicer carbon fiber frame, 12-speed Shimano 105 Di2 electronic shifting, and carbon wheels. And it would actually leave me with about $1,000 to spare because it's currently on sale. So that seems like legitimate progress to me, particularly since there's no question which one of those two I'd rather ride today. And then even at the higher end, so Trek had a 5500, which I wanted but couldn't afford. A Trek 5500 back then was just over $3,000 US, which would roughly translate to about about $7,000 US now. But that would be a mid-range bike right now. So at that end of the market, or I guess kind of like in the middle, it seems like things are pretty good. So
Yeah.
like, are bikes in general a lot more expensive though? Or is it more the case that we just have so many more options at the ultra premium end of the spectrum that just seems like they're all more expensive now?
I think it's the latter. Yeah, I think the mid-price bikes, when you really look into it, are not necessarily more expensive than what they were 10 years ago, adjusting for inflation, and also keeping in mind the technology has moved forward. Like, it's just simply more expensive to make a hydraulic disc brake than it is to make a caliper rim brake. And I think, you're probably comparing those bikes, and maybe some of those treks you're just using, James, the wheels, like probably not the SL6, but you go up a level, you're moving from aluminium wheels to now a carbon fiber rimmed.
That SL6 comes with carbon wheels.
Oh, there you go. So
Yeah.
I mean, the technology is very different. Like, if you were to try truly compare apples to apples, then that bike is cheaper now than it used to be, given the technology. And that you'd expect with time for the tech to trickle down. But yeah, it is more expensive for disc brakes. It is more expensive for electronic shifting. And you could be skeptical and say, well, that's just the industry trying to squeeze more money out of every customer by doing this technology. But it also does create a better bike. So I think there's a few elements there. But yes, it does feel like the ultra premium, the market for the ultra premium has grown. The amount of wealthy people in cycling has certainly grown. And, we saw that 10 years ago where people were saying cycling is the new golf. And I think that remains true. And yeah, I think that very, very top tier of the sport has definitely expanded in options where it's become a little bit normalized to have those 20 to 24,000 Australian dollar bikes we were talking about before, or 15,000 US. I certainly don't remember that when I was certainly early days of getting into cycling, but for the Ultegra and the 105 level bikes, I think we saw some crazy pricing during COVID, but I think it's starting to normalize and return back to very comparable pricing to what it used to be.
I wonder too if some of this is related to the marketing, because we've said this before in the past, I think many times, that by and large, the bike industry repeatedly reverts to its old habits of relying on competition, racing specifically, as the means to like how it promotes its products, its new bikes and everything. And of course, in that world, when you're looking at their top sponsored athletes and teams, all of those people are going to be riding on the company's nicest stuff. And I'd say, like, in the marketing, and this goes in media too. I mean, these are often the bikes that brands supply to media for reviews and stuff. Sure. Unless they request otherwise, which we often do, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah, that Yeti was an exception just purely because it gave me the opportunity to ride flight attendant.
Yeah. I mean, you and I had a discussion when you were requesting that Yeti for review, like which one should you bring in? And initially we were thinking the mid-range one would make more sense, but then like, actually we can bring in a flight attendant bike. Anyway, back to my point. I wonder if the marketing has a lot to do with people's perception of what is going on in the industry as far as bike pricing, because all they typically see is the super, super expensive stuff. So when you look at an ad and a review and whatever, and someone's talking about, oh, this $9,000 bike is awesome. This $13,000 bike is awesome. Of course it's awesome. It's super expensive. Yeah. But I think if we take a more rational look at what is actually out there, and in that middle range specifically, things actually kind of look pretty good.
Yep, they look really good. The exception to that is entry-level road bikes, unquestionably more expensive. And I think that's just, again, it's the technology involved. It's them wanting to equip disc brakes at an entry-level price point has forced that category of bike up. But yeah, once you get above that and you get into the more carbon fiber level bike, I actually think it's looking pretty decent to me.
Like $2,000.
There are some exceptions.
$2,000 buys you a pretty decent road bike right now, particularly from a consumer direct brand. You can get an awful lot of bike for that. And then like in the mountain bike space, actually that looks in a lot of ways pretty good too, because I would say for a while, I mean, mountain bike companies have certainly had to deal with the economical challenges of offering those features that people expect in higher end bikes at a lower price point. So it's understandable that those bikes are going to be heavier, but at the same time, you are still able to get a lower priced full suspension mountain bike with hydraulic disc brakes and kind of somewhat decent suspension, stuff like that. Like not for $2,000, but but compared to what things used to cost, we're not seeing the sort of like gross inflation that a lot of people are talking about, I think, anyway, at least not in that bread and butter range of the market.
Yeah. And again, for me, it comes back to if you really understand the technology at play here, there's a reason why things should be more expensive now than they were. 15 years ago, if you pulled open a RockShox fork, it looks pretty different to what it does today. There used to be a lot of rubber and plastic inside of there and not a lot of advanced shim stacks and all that. And now the components are far more intricate than they were. The tolerances are tighter. The materials used are more expensive. The whole structure has to be stiffer because the wheel that it's mounted to is much larger and the travel is longer and the expectation of what it will survive has come a long way. I think you just got to consider that, how bikes are used and the expectations around them has greatly changed and the technology has shifted. And I don't really think it's fair to directly compare a bike pricing from today to 10 years ago. But when you do and you account for inflation, it's often not as bad as you may think.
Yeah, it's funny, just kind of sticking to that suspension thing for a moment. Manitou introduced not too long ago, they announced sort of like a retro look version of their Mezzer long travel fork. It's got like, kind of silver dropouts and silver arch, kind of like it's sort of designed to look like it was CNC machined to an extent. And it would be astounding to hold up one of those forks right next to one of the forks from 20, 30 years ago that is designed to emulate visually. And one is just laughable, the difference in size between the two. Like one would almost look like a toy in comparison. But then to look at sort of the internals and look at how much more advanced the newer version is, there's no comparison. But anyway, back to your point. I do really think that the bike industry has done itself no favors by, again, concentrating and putting so much emphasis on the ultra high end of things. Yeah. It's sort of like if Ford had spent the majority of its marketing budget on promoting like, the GT or something like
the Shelby vehicles. Yeah.
Yeah. It just doesn't make any sense because even though, yes, that's where the most technology is and that's where it has kind of like the most prestige and like the most performance and everything, that's not what most people are buying. And the bike industry is kind of funny like that. And at least at this point, I don't really know if that's ever going to change. I would like it to. But certainly we hear an awful lot of outrage. And just to be clear, I'm with you, people. I'm with you as far as how expensive things are at the very, very high end. But just to kind of temper that a little bit, like when you really just sit down and look at how much it costs to make nice stuff these days, and you look at what is involved and you look at what bikes actually cost now as far as in that mid-range price point, like kind of like, again, like that kind of bell curve bread and butter stuff, the bikes are pretty good.
Yep. And fundamentally in this conversation, I also think a lot of people forget that that brands and businesses exist to make profit.
Oh, weird. Really?
Yeah. Huh. So yes, maybe a carbon frame does cost $300 to $400 to produce. But by the time you add in, the marketing expenses, the shipping costs, the distribution costs, the warehousing and everything else, and duties and imports, and at that point, maybe it's $3,000 cost. They still need to make money on it because it's not a charity.
Well, and then I guess looking at it in terms of percentages, like I think what would be a lot more shocking to people is if they looked into like what clothing costs to produce or what sneakers cost to produce, stuff like that. Like
those industries are much better businesses than the bike
world. Those numbers are absolutely shocking. Like if like a garment, like the way that most of them are produced now, they cost virtually nothing to make. And then you're buying a t-shirt these days for what, like $20, $30?
Yeah.
Like $20 if you're lucky.
There is a reason that when you go to a large shopping center, you don't necessarily find a bicycle store, but you do find hundreds of clothing stores. Much better businesses.
Yeah. How's that saying go about how to make $1 million in the bike industry? All right. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to our PSA for this week. All right, for this week's PSA, I think we talk a lot about maintenance areas on your bikes and things to look at in general here on Geek Warning. But if I'm remembering correctly, and to be clear, I often forget which ones of these we talked about. I don't think we've talked a whole bunch about cranks. So my PSA for this week is if you haven't pulled out your crankset in a while, certainly if you don't remember the last time you did it, now might be a good time. Because especially if you ride in the wet, or even if you just sort of wash your bike occasionally, water and dirt have this uncanny ability to get into your frame, especially now with all this internal routing and all these holes everywhere. Bikes have an uncanny ability to collect water and dirt at the bottom of your bike. And even if you have a drain hole at the bottom bracket shell, which most bikes do, but even if you have that hole, it's pretty small. And if you haven't pulled your crankset and maybe even your bottom bracket cups, there's a pretty decent chance that, well, I mean, you might be kind of surprised at what you find in there. It might, maybe some water, maybe some rust, just corrosion in general, maybe a whole lot of dirt.
Yep.
I mean, if nothing else, I mean, Dave, I think you would be in support of this. Like it's like it might be a good excuse to buy some new tools if you haven't done so already, as far as what you need to pull that stuff out of there. Because oftentimes, like you pull that stuff out and Shimano cranks, for example, use a steel spindle, and if there's a bunch of water sitting on there, those spindles can corrode and they do break. So that was the reference.
They can break.
Well, yes, but I mean, I think
not all of them break.
No, at least not the spindle anyway. Sorry, Solano. But there certainly have been instances of spindles breaking, and a lot of that is due to corrosion.
Sure.
So, again, it's something that's on the inside of your bike that is not easily seen because you're just not paying attention to it, and there's some disassembly involved to inspect that area. But yeah, like I said, if you haven't done so in quite a while, it might be a good idea to pull that stuff out of there. If nothing else, just kind of clean and re-grease and stuff like that. And if nothing else, it might kind of get rid of some noise.
Yeah, and I guess like on that theme, like that, this is why running a worn out bottom bracket is quite hazardous, is that worn out bottom bracket basically allows that crankset to start shifting, sort of moving out of sync between the two bearings, and you'll basically get abrasion wear on that spindle as a result of it. So you could potentially wear out your crankset if you neglect your bottom bracket.
Especially if it's aluminum.
Likewise, if you were to have a little bit of play in your crankset, that spindle will also get wear on it. So yeah, it's a good idea to pull it out, check for any sort of corrosion, but also check at the points where the bearings would sit, the bottom bracket bearings would sit in line with that spindle, check it for wear. You can actually measure it. You should be able to measure the diameter of the spindle. And if you've got a 30 millimeter spindle and it measures 29.7 and you can see some wear on it, you probably need a new crankset. It's quite common, especially with aluminum cranks, which are not as durable against abrasion.
It's funny. A lot of people like to criticize Shimano for using those little plastic hat inserts in their bottom brackets. But those little plastic sleeves serve a very good purpose as far as protecting that spindle from that abrasion wear that you were talking about. Like if you want to look up fretting, that's basically what you're talking about. Those little plastic sleeves are pretty useful.
Not just Shimano. SRAM Dub is basically BB30 with plastic hats. That's something not well understood with Dub is SRAM went from a 30 mil spindle, 30 mil bearing to 28.99. That millimeter less is basically a 30 mil bearing with a plastic hat on it.
And it is effective. It does prevent that fretting wear that you were talking about.
Yeah. I think a lot of people saw Dub as like a whole new bearing and everything, but it's not. It's a common bearing that you probably had in your bike previously, but it's got that protective anti-creak / anti-abrasion plastic cap on it. So yeah, it's a very common method, and it's a good way of protecting the spindle. But yeah, I agree, James. Take your spindle out, inspect it. Also inspect the center of the spindle, because sometimes bikes that have not been assembled correctly might actually have like the brake hose or a gear cable rubbing through the spindle. And that, from what I've seen, is probably the most common reason for Shimano spindles to break, is you saw through them.
And that's often a spectacular failure.
Yeah. So, take that crank out of your bike. It's not super hard to do. It can be quite difficult if your crank is seized on. But yeah, especially with like Shimano cranks, it's very simple to do. You need 2 tools. It's a 5mm hex key and one of those Holytech cap tools, which you could 3D print at home.
Ooh, there's another plug there. How about that? All right. Well, that's our PSA for this week. So hopefully you found that helpful. I'm particularly interested to hear if anyone, I mean, we put out these PSAs pretty regularly. I don't know if we hear a whole lot from our members in particular, if like anyone ever took our advice to heart and did followed one of those PSAs and found something. Like, have we prevented anything here, Dave? We don't really know. But if anyone listening right now, if you do decide to pull your spindle out, pull your crankset apart, and let us know. I guess head over to that Discord channel for Escape Collective members, and let us know if you found anything in there that was surprising, and if we maybe saved you a little bit of heartache down the road. All right. Well, before we wrap up, we've got just a couple little bits of smaller news. Dave, as part of that Yeti, you also kind of stumbled upon a couple little new things coming down the pipe, right?
Yeah. There's 2 products on that Yeti that aren't yet released. There's some new carbon DT Swiss wheels on there, the XRC 1200 spline. I think they're still a few months away from hitting production and being released. But DT Swiss's new lightest mountain bike race wheel. They're roughly 1,300 grams, 30 mil internal width rim, new asymmetric front and rear specific carbon rims that are laid up in Switzerland. Pretty fancy wheel. Pretty nice.
The hubs are very shiny.
The hubs are shiny. The hubs have ceramic bearings inside. They're DT Swiss 180 hubs. They're using the new Revolite spoke, which is kind of a halfway between a bladed and a round spoke. It's like basically a bladed spoke with a round spoke running through the center of it to give it more sideways stiffness. It's
sort of like a cross section of the Saturn.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like a new mountain bike, lightweight mountain bike specific spoke. Anyway, those are cool wheels. I have no idea what they cost, but I mean, I've ridden them and we've kind of just shared all the technical details about them. So we'll see when they come out. And the other product on that bike, which I think we'll probably see a lot of in the future, is a new WTB saddle. I believe it's called the Solano. And again, I can only assume this is probably going to come out at Sea Otter, but again, I've sat on it and taken photos of it, and it is on that Yeti bike that you can see. But it's basically a new short nose saddle from WTB, and it had a generous rail length for good range of adjustment. The padding was nice and cushy without being too soft. I found the shape pretty good, and I'm normally pretty fussy about saddles. WTB tends to get a lot of OE presence on mountain bikes and gravel bikes, and I think this will be I really am betting on this being the new go-to saddle for a lot of brands that spec WTB saddles. I mean it's got that trendy shorter nose, and I think this is something we'll see a lot of.
So, fun fact. Solano is the name that WTB used to use for a road tire that they had in the range 15-ish, maybe more years ago.
So branding's hard, and if you're in the trademark, that's the easiest option.
Exactly. In other news, from SRAM, we got a release that they've had wireless blips, those remote controllers for their Axis electronic stuff. Those have been around for a while, but they've always kind of had to be in tandem with some other thing, either like a main set of levers or like what they call a blip box. And now they're saying that those wireless blips can be used on their own, which to some people might not seem like that big of a deal, but especially if you're in like time trials or triathlons or something like that, the fact that you can now use those blips without a blip box is a big deal because it opens up an awful lot of flexibility in terms of your cockpit setup. It also opens up some flexibility on the mountain bike side too, because you've got companies like Leap Components, for example, that make very convenient adapters for those blip shifters. And the fact that you can use those and just kind of on their own to kind of do whatever you want is pretty cool.
It is cool. On the mountain bike, it is worth noting that those blips will not control an axis dropper post.
Yes, correct.
Something to do with them only allowing a short press, whereas the axis dropper post needs a long press. And because the batteries in the blips are not replaceable, they disabled that for battery longevity reasons. So
not officially replaceable, we should say, Dave.
Oh yeah, there is actually a pretty regular coin cell battery inside that shifter.
Yeah, it's like a 1632 or something like that. But you've got to be able to crack it open without destroying the thing and then replace the battery and then put it back together and still have it be totally sealed and whatnot. So yeah, technically speaking, they are disposable.
Yeah.
But with a little bit of elbow grease, you can get them open. Anyway, SRAM is not going to be happy about us telling people that. Anyway.
Yeah.
Other news. So, a good sign that hot chain waxing has become mainstream finish line. They haven't officially announced this yet, but they have a new immersion wax pending. It's part of a new waxing range in general called Halo. So they apparently are going to have a hot wax in that range, and they're also going to have a couple of drip lubes available. I contacted Finish Line about this, and they don't have any official info, but they said they are planning for a spring launch. We'll see what that looks like.
I don't mean to sound too mean on this, but it seems like these products will be silky smooth. If you look at the range and what they're doing and what the ingredients are, it's very evident what they're following here. It's basically Silka's chain lube range. You know, it's a premium hot melt wax, a premium drip wax lube, and then a premium wet oil-based lube, which is Silka.
Sounds familiar.
And they've also got like tungsten as an ingredient. Anyway, I think it's cool. Like Finish Line is such a traditional bicycle maintenance company. It's very mainstream, very wide distribution. So the fact that they're offering a wax product is very telling of how popular it has become.
Well, I would love to see Finish Line stepping up its chain lubricant game, because for as big a name as they are, and if I understand correctly, Finish Line is basically just sort of like a consumer-facing division of DuPont.
Yep. And White Lightning is also under the same banner. Yeah.
So they certainly have the capability of offering a pretty incredible product. But Dave, I'm pretty sure you would agree with me that Finish Line in general, as far as their chain lubricants go, have been pretty underwhelming, to put it mildly.
They're a decade behind.
Easily. So the fact that they are finally leaping forward like this, even if they're just kind of coming up with a product that's maybe not quite as good as the best stuff out there, but if it's like even kind of close, I would consider that a good thing, particularly since with Finish Line's distribution, that means a lot more people are probably going to be exposed to this stuff. Yeah,
for sure. So anyway, it's cool to see new entrants new old entrants into the space. So
totally. Yeah. Last little bit of news for Strava has just announced a whole bunch of new features for paid members. I guess specifically for cycling anyway, they have had these things called best efforts on the running side for a little while, but they've now brought that over to the cycling side. It's now giving you some more performance metrics to look at to track your progress and stuff like elevation gain, biggest single climbs, and best power outputs and that sort of thing. I'm not going to go into the whole list. If you're a paid subscriber to Strava, best thing to do, just head over into the app and dig into there a little bit, because you might notice a few new things that you can see now that you have access to that you might not have seen a couple weeks ago. So
great.
Fun stuff for people who like to really analyze their rides after the fact. All right. Well, that'll do it for this week's episode of Geek Warning. Last little bits of info, I guess, before we wrap up. So I'm guessing if you're a fan of Geek Warning, you're like well, you must be if you're listening to this right now. But just as a reminder, we do also have members-only episodes, and those will include deeper dives into particular topics and interviews with key folks in the bike industry, a whole bunch more. So that Zip one is a free one because we kind of took the viewpoint that that's sort of more like a public service thing because it's sort of safety related. Escape Collective members also get access to Ronan's Performance Process podcast, where he kind of gets way into the weeds on performance optimization for both you and your bike. And if you like to work on your own bike at home, be sure to sign up for Dave's threaded newsletter. That one's free to everyone and can also be found on escapecollective.com. But it's kind of always nice to just kind of get it delivered straight into your inbox. So head over to Escape Collective, find threaded, and sign up there. And speaking of membership, don't forget that we are a 100% member-funded operation here at Escape Collective. So that means you are never going to see any annoying ads or like creepy affiliate links or like nothing icky on the site in general. You also won't hear any ads on our podcast either. So if you like what we're doing, and if you're not a member, please consider, well, quit being a freeloader basically and help support what we're doing here by going to escapecollective.com/join.
Yeah. Bill, you're listening? It's time.
It's your turn.
You've been listening to us for at least 6 months now. And every week we say we don't have advertising, but this is an ad. Like, we're advertising for ourselves because if we don't, someone has to speak for us. And anyway, Bill, it's time.
Yeah, Bill, because if we go under, it's your fault. Just FYI.
Jeez. Oh, my.
All right, and with that, thanks as always for listening, and we'll see you next week for another episode of Geek Morning.